Why Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu never worked together again. The reason still shocks fans. They were the couple every Turkish drama fan was rooting for. On screen, they had the kind of chemistry that made viewers forget they were watching fiction. Off-screen, they seemed inseparable. And then, without any warning, without any official statement, without any real explanation, it was over. Not just the relationship. The professional partnership. The friendship. All of it. Gone. And years later, fans are still asking the same question. Why did Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu never work together again? Because here's the thing. When two people share what they shared, the fame, the success, the public adoration, you would expect them to find their way back to each other professionally, even if the personal side did not survive. That is how this industry usually works. Actors move on. Projects happen. Collaborations continue. But that never happened here. And the more you look into it, the more complicated the picture becomes. This is not just a breakup story. This is a story about what happens when two people become so intertwined with each other's identity that separating professionally feels almost impossible, and attempting it anyway comes at a cost that neither of them fully anticipated. Let's go back to the beginning, because you cannot understand where this story ends without understanding where it started. Barış Arduç had already built a reputation as one of Turkish television's most bankable young actors by the time he landed the lead role in Gönül İşleri. He was charming, magnetic, and had a natural ease in front of the camera that directors loved. But it was his pairing with Elçin Sangu that changed everything for both of them. Elçin Sangu was not an unknown. She had her own dedicated following, her own body of work, and a presence that could hold a scene without trying. But when the two of them shared the screen for the first time, something clicked in a way that you cannot manufacture and you cannot plan. The audience felt it immediately. The ratings reflected it within weeks. And then something happened that almost never happens in Turkish entertainment. The audience started caring about the actors as much as the characters. Social media began tracking their every interaction. Fans started piecing together behind-the-scenes footage, interviews, press appearances. There were glances. There were smiles that seemed to linger a beat too long. And slowly, the question shifted from, will their characters end up together, to, are they actually together in real life? The answer, as the world eventually found out, was yes. Their relationship became one of the most talked about in Turkish celebrity culture. And here is where the story gets complicated, because that kind of public attention is not just flattering. It is a pressure system. It changes the dynamic between two people in ways that are difficult to predict and even harder to manage. Think about what it means to have your relationship become a product. Fans expect consistency. They expect access. They compare the real version of you to the version they fell in love with on screen. And when reality does not match the fantasy, when you have a bad day or a disagreement or a moment of doubt, there is nowhere to process that privately, because the public has already decided who you are to each other. Barış and Elçin handled the attention with remarkable grace for a long time. They were private without being cold. They acknowledged the relationship without oversharing. By the standards of modern celebrity relationships, they navigated it well. But there were signs, if you knew where to look, that the pressure was building. Sources close to both of them, and it is important to note these are unverified accounts from entertainment media, not official statements, suggested that the overlap between their professional and personal lives had begun to feel suffocating. When your co-star is also your partner, you never fully leave work. Every script, every scene, every director's note carries a personal weight that ordinary professional relationships do not have. And then there were the comparisons. This part is rarely discussed openly, but it matters. When two actors rise together, the public and the industry have a tendency to rank them. Who is the bigger star? Who carries the project? Whose name comes first? These are questions that can quietly corrode even the strongest relationships, because no matter how much two people love each other, nobody is fully immune to the sting of feeling like the supporting act in their own story. There is no confirmed evidence that rivalry or professional jealousy played a role in their breakup. But anyone who has worked in entertainment will tell you that these dynamics exist, that they are rarely spoken about directly, and that they leave marks. The breakup, when it came, was handled as quietly as a breakup of that magnitude can be handled. There was no dramatic public falling out, no explosive interview, no social media posts dripping with subtext. They simply stopped being publicly visible as a couple, and then it became apparent to anyone paying attention that things had ended. And the silence that followed was, in some ways, louder than anything they could have said. Because here is what fans noticed almost immediately. There were no warm comments on each other's posts. No public acknowledgement of the other's projects. No industry events where they were photographed together. In a world where ex-couples routinely maintain public friendships, especially when they work in the same industry, the distance between Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu was striking. Why? That is the question that has lingered for years. And there are several theories, though it is important to be clear about which ones are grounded in documented fact and which ones belong in the category of fan speculation. The most widely circulated theory is simply this: the emotional fallout from the relationship made continued proximity impossible. Not because of hostility, necessarily, but because of the particular kind of pain that comes when something you believed in deeply does not work out. Some people can compartmentalize that pain and continue working together. Some cannot. And there is no shame in belonging to the second category. There is also the question of what the relationship represented to their respective fan bases. When Barış and Elçin were together, they existed in the public imagination as a kind of proof that the chemistry people felt watching them was real, that the love story was not just performance. When the relationship ended, something broke in that narrative. And working together again would mean reopening that wound for everyone, including themselves. Entertainment industry insiders, and again, these are background sources, not people speaking on the record, have suggested that there were conversations at various points about potential collaborations. Projects where both of them were considered. But each time, it did not come together. Whether that was because of scheduling, or creative differences, or something more personal, nobody outside their immediate circle knows for certain. What we do know is that both of them moved forward. And watching how they did it tells you something. Barış Arduç took on projects that pushed him into new territory. He diversified. He took creative risks. He built a professional identity that was increasingly his own, separate from the chapter of his career that the audience most associated with him alongside Elçin. It felt, watching from the outside, like someone deliberately stepping out from under a long shadow, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Elçin Sangu did something similar, but in her own way. She continued working, continued building, and made choices that seemed calibrated to assert her own independent artistic identity. Her performances in the years following the breakup were, by many accounts, some of the strongest of her career. There is a particular kind of clarity that can come from rebuilding something that was broken. It does not excuse the pain, but it is real. And yet fans could not let go. The internet has a long memory, and the YouTube comment sections under old clips of their scenes together became a kind of ongoing memorial. People rewatching those moments. People saying they still got emotional. People asking, sometimes with genuine grief in their words, why this could not have been preserved. There is something worth pausing on here, because it speaks to something larger than just this specific story. We live in an era where the line between performer and person has almost completely dissolved. Audiences do not just watch actors anymore. They follow them. They invest. They create parasocial relationships that feel, from the inside, astonishingly real. And when the real story diverges from the narrative they had constructed in their heads, the loss they feel is not pretend. The grief fans expressed over Barış and Elçin was not irrational. It was the natural result of having been invited, subtly and not so subtly, to care about them as a unit. The industry does this deliberately. It is good for ratings, good for social media engagement, good for the commercial infrastructure that celebrity culture runs on. But it does not prepare anyone, the fans or the actors, for what happens when the unit dissolves. There were, over the years, moments that reignited the conversation. A photo would surface from an old event. A clip would go viral. Someone would post a thread breaking down every scene they shared, frame by frame, with the kind of analytical devotion usually reserved for ancient texts. And each time, the comments would flood in. People asking if there was any chance of a reunion project. People tagging them both, as if volume alone might conjure something back into existence. Neither of them ever engaged with this directly, at least not in any meaningful way. And that silence, maintained consistently over years, began to feel like its own kind of answer. There is a version of the story where the ending is simply sad. Two talented people, who once meant something important to each other, who created work together that genuinely moved people, are now living parallel lives with no obvious intersection. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot to absorb. But there is another version, and it is worth considering. Both Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu are, by any reasonable measure, doing well. They are working. They are growing. They have each, in their own way, built something after the chapter that the audience fixated on. The story did not end with the relationship. It continued. It is still continuing. The shock that fans feel when they confront this reality, the never worked together again reality, comes from a specific kind of hope that entertainment culture cultivates. The hope that great on-screen chemistry is a promise. That it points towards something permanent. That if the love was real, it should be unconquerable. But creative partnership, even one grounded in genuine feeling, is not a fairy tale. It is a negotiation between two real people with real limitations, real wounds, and real lives that do not pause for audience expectations. The fact that Barış and Elçin have not found their way back to a shared project is not a failure. It is a human response to a human situation. That said, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting, the question of whether a reunion project could ever happen has not entirely been put to rest. Turkish entertainment moves in long arcs. Actors who once seemed permanently estranged have surprised people. The industry has its own rhythms and its own logic, and sometimes, years after the wound has healed, two people find they can be in the same room again without it costing them something unbearable. Nobody is saying that is the inevitable outcome here. The trajectory, as things stand, does not obviously point in that direction. But the door has never been formally and publicly closed. Neither of them has said never. And in the entertainment industry, never is almost always a provisional word. What fans want, underneath the rewatched clips and the nostalgic comment threads, is probably something simpler than a reunion project. They want to know that the thing they felt when they watched those scenes was real. That the connection existed. That it mattered. And here, at least, the record is clear. Whatever happened after, and however complicated the aftermath became, the chemistry was real. The performances were real. The impact on the audience was real. Those scenes exist. They are not going anywhere. And 1,000 future projects from both of them will not erase the particular thing they created together. There is a line in a Turkish interview that Elçin Sangu gave some years after the relationship ended, and this is paraphrased from translated sources, not a direct quote, where she spoke about how certain chapters of your life shape you in ways you only understand later. How the work you do in those chapters carries its own truth, regardless of how the personal story resolves. She did not mention Barış by name. She did not need to. Anyone paying attention understood what she was describing. And Barış, in his own way, has said similar things. About gratitude. About growth. About the way certain experiences teach you who you are, even when they do not have the ending you hoped for. These are not the words of two people who hate each other. They are the words of two people who are doing the difficult, quiet, unglamorous work of processing something that was significant and then moving forward. That is not the ending fans dreamed of. But it might be the most honest ending available. So why did Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu never work together again? Because some chapters are complete. Because the professional and the personal were too entwined to easily separate. Because the industry, the audience, the pressure, and the very thing that made them special together also made moving on together almost impossible. Because sometimes two people can give each other something extraordinary and still not be able to sustain it. And because working together again would have required a kind of courage and emotional architecture that, at least so far, has not been available to either of them. The story is not finished. Neither of their careers are finished. And life has a tendency to circle back in ways that even the most careful analysts do not predict. But for now, what we are left with is a body of work that still moves people. Two careers that are still developing. And a question that has no definitive answer, only honest ones. They gave something to the audience that audiences rarely get. They gave it genuinely. And maybe